In Elden Ring, PvP is a point of conflict and contention. It pits player against player in a fight to the death. The most aggressive variety, invasions, allows for one-sided aggression that is thrust upon an unsuspecting party. They are, at their most effective, disruptive, violent, and sudden. Thus, the question stands: should invasions be optional? But before we can answer that, we need to cover some basics. In the Souls series, PvP happens in three main forms: invasions, duels, and Colosseum matches. Of the three, only invasions really have an involuntary component, so that's what we're going to focus on. Before anything, I want to establish that invasions are already an opt-in mechanic in Elden Ring. You need to actively participate in multiplayer to be eligible. But that's not all that clear-cut when we're talking about what makes invasions truly optional. Optional, at least to me, implies you have a direct and clear choice, something you can decide in isolation. With invasions, you become eligible when you make a separate, seemingly unrelated choice. While intentional, it raises an issue with the PvE, or rather the anti-PvP community. In previous games, invasions were still optional, but potentially less so. In Demon's Souls, you were eligible for invasion anytime you were in body form. In Dark Souls, you could be invaded anytime you were human. In Dark Souls 2, you could be invaded anytime at all unless taking preventative measures. It was first in Bloodborne where multiplayer became the direct catalyst for invasions. Summoning another player caused a sinister bell ringer to appear somewhere in your world and beckon invaders. And in Dark Souls 3, to participate in multiplayer at all required using an Ember, which came with a nice health increase to compensate for the added danger. But in all these games, invasions are rarely viewed as optional by the player base, and I'd say that's not an unreasonable stance. You make a seemingly unrelated decision, and suddenly you're hunted by the world's most dangerous game. For a new player who doesn't understand the game at its most basic, the added stress of a veteran player turning the game extremely competitive can be a backstab too far. This sort of negative experience can urge players to avoid playing cooperatively or play entirely offline to avoid any risk of invasion. To me, that's a reasonable compromise. The game gives a way to avoid invasions entirely for players who find them too disruptive or undesirable, though with the concession that they experience potentially less of the game. And that is how I feel about playing offline. I think it's a lesser way to experience the game. There are passive mechanics such as specters and messages that add to the experience in a relatively non-disruptive fashion. Having to play offline just to avoid PvP means giving up something unrelated. So it makes sense that these games would give players the ability to avoid invasions while still engaging with the passive online functions. Elden Ring has established firmly that invasions can only naturally occur while cooperating with another player. But, as you may well know, there are still players who feel that PvP being tied to co-op isn't fair, that penalizing them for playing with friends or other allies is counterintuitive. It feels like a trick. And while it's not a trick, it is a less than subtle way to ensure players understand a trade is being made. That when they get help, it invites new hindrances. It's essentially a way to broadly ensure the integrity of the game by allowing players to act against one another. By that logic alone, we can safely say there's no real issue. If you opt into multiplayer, you opt into all multiplayer. It's that simple. Returning to the logistics of optional mechanics and in point of fact, every aspect of multiplayer in these games is entirely optional. They are designed with a clear intention to be experienced solo, and every online aspect is some bonus or alteration to that experience. As much as I might prefer the online adjustments, I can't deny that it's optional. But that's not the point I'm getting at. We all know invasions are optional. The question I'm posing is, should they be? Well, why and why not? The argument for keeping them optional, or potentially making them even more optional via a toggle or flag system held in isolation, is that people shouldn't be forced to play the game in a way they don't want to. If players want PvP, they can opt in, and if they don't want it, they can opt out without any other trade-off. It's a simple argument that essentially boils down to giving players what they want when and how they want it. But I don't think that conforms to the idea of a game. Much in the same way modding a game can trivialize or otherwise alter the challenge, giving players the option to pick and choose which aspects of the game they approve of can be damaging to the core of the experience. Without an adequate set of guidelines, it becomes impossible to determine what that experience even looks like. Difficulty sliders come to mind here. A boss might be difficult on one difficulty setting, but a complete pushover on another. Which of the two is the correct experience? And obviously, there is no correct way to play a game, only the way the game allows you to play. Which brings me to the counter-argument of why not. Options divide the player base and can, at their worst, jeopardize the developer's intentions. If every player has the ability to pick and choose mechanics to be included or excluded, that places a tremendous amount of trust in that player to do so responsibly, to do it in a way that will give them the optimal experience. Furthering that, when a player can choose an option that removes that option for another player, it creates a chain reaction. If 40% of players opt out of invasions, then the remaining 60% are either invaders with a smaller selection of targets, or targets with a higher number of invaders, which could then cause them to opt out due to the higher frequency of invasions, further reducing the number of targets. And this goes on and on until the only targets of invasions are other invaders. It's basically every long-abandoned fighting game where unless you know every tech and have your combos on lock, you're going to have a bad time. For invasions specifically, this would be the death of the mechanic. It's not designed like a duel or other voluntary fight. It's designed to be a prepared player attacking a group of unprepared players. It can end up a lot of different ways, and it's not always well done, but at its core, removing any incentive to be invaded and allowing it to be entirely opt-in would pretty much be the end of invasions. To that point, I am of the mindset that not only is it counterintuitive to ask players to self-govern, especially when they may have little or no knowledge of the mechanics they're judging, but it's harmful to the player base as a whole. Players have a natural inclination to minimize risk. If they can simply remove the ability to be invaded, they will. Not because they don't respect the game or what invasions offer, but because they can't be asked to be objective about something that often comes at their expense, even if it has long-term benefits. And that risk aversion is only amplified when we talk about mechanics that aren't commonplace or a primary aspect of the game. The PvP in Souls games, specifically Invasions, stands as one of the rarest occurrences in any game. By participating in mechanics that would seem unrelated to the uninitiated, a player can invoke the wrath of another player. They can be attacked and killed with minimal consideration to balance or fairness. This, understandably, rubs a lot of players the wrong way. They aren't accustomed to being used as a mop on what they would otherwise consider their own floor. But that's what invasions can do to the inexperienced. And it's beautiful. It's the best thing in any game ever. The only thing that could improve it is if you couldn't opt out. Let me explain. I don't mean you should constantly be invaded. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be any way to avoid invasions. What I'm suggesting is invasions should be considered a core and essential part of the experience, rather than something that happens only under the right circumstances. Invasions should occur under the wrong circumstances, under the worst if possible. A random invader appearing when you're at your least prepared is the most exciting thing I've ever experienced in a game. It's something I strive to recreate for as many players as possible. It's foundational as to why I love these games so much. Sure, there are countless other merits, but without invasions, none of that would matter to me how it matters now. But Elden Ring hasn't done invasions any favors. It has seen to it that the only way to be invaded is when you're ready, when you're at your most prepared. Sure, you might not win, but the game goes out of its way to give even the most careless host a fighting chance. And on a basic level, I'm fine with that. I'm okay with the odds sitting in the host's favor. I don't care for it in a lot of ways, and I think it's the opposite direction invasions should head, but it's not the worst thing. Instead, what I find most damaging to invasions is their existence as a secondary mechanic. This is actually true of the entire multiplayer experience in these games. It's a secondary feature added to the primary, and it suffers dearly for it. If you or a loved one have ever tried to play one of these games for the first time with someone else, and realize not only can you not just invite them via a menu, but you have to collect specific items and meet invisible in-game criteria to participate, you understand why this is a problem. But Emo John, you, an active hater, shout at me. It's not an MMO. I know that. Obviously, I know that. Don't you think I know that? That doesn't mean the multiplayer can't be better. I love the obscurity of these games, but I think making the parameters of summoning clear to the player would be a net benefit. And improving the multiplayer in these games doesn't damage the single player. There are and always have been ways to avoid all aspects of multiplayer with far more ease than engaging with them. The single player experience is intact, and that will almost certainly never change. And I think that's largely a good thing. As much as I love the multiplayer, I often choose to go it alone. Not because I don't want to play with others, but because sometimes it's important that I do things for myself. Additionally, the games are clearly designed for a single player, and I don't want to cheat myself out of a developer's intention before I know what I'm missing. Which is why I want them to stop considering multiplayer, and PvP specifically, optional. I want them to lean into the more chaotic elements of their design, to give as much attention to it as they do the rest of the game. I want to have the multiplayer be just as valid and impactful as the single player, to have a boss able to handle multiple opponents competently, rather than with something as ineffective as more health. Multiplayer should be different, not worse or lesser. As it stands, it's far from uncommon to hear a complaint about the multiplayer and then a response along the lines of, well, it's a single-player game, what'd you expect? That's a response I want dead in the dirt, as far down the blind hole as it'll go. Especially because it's true. These games are single-player, with multiplayer added after the fact. Therefore, it's given license to suck. It's allowed to be bad because it's not the reason most people bought the game. I want that to change because multiplayer is the reason I bought the game. There are other reasons, and many of them, but multiplayer is at the top of my list. I'm past the point of playing solo-only games and headcanoning my way through, thinking how great it would be if I could take my character and interact with others. While there are some exceptions, I think games in general should move past the lockdown nature of single-player and multiplayer-only designs. The second you realize a game can be both simultaneously and capture the best of both worlds when done well, everything else seems obsolete. What's the advantage of not having a multiplayer experience if an entire single-player experience can exist alongside it? Sure, if a developer can't manage to or doesn't want to implement both, fair enough. But if they have any interest in expanding the options their game affords its players, it has huge potential. And the method of dividing the two can vary, but I think online and offline modes are the most effective. You're either connected to the outside world or you aren't, giving you absolute control over the experience without having to pick between aspects of those realities. Aspects like PvP. Setting aside the greater scope of game design, let's reiterate how PvP primarily functions in Elden Ring. You summon a cooperator and can then be invaded. It's essentially a balancing act. If you don't want PvP, don't cooperate. But wouldn't the game be better if you didn't have to make that choice? Wouldn't it make more sense if you were always eligible for both on the premise that you are a part of a larger, interconnected world? How much sense does it make to have it split by degrees of separation, each further out than the last? At best, you get a buffer that shields only the uninterested, and at worst you severely damage the activity and viability of your PvP experience. Think about it. No one chooses to PvP when they don't think they can win. No one willingly subjects themselves to certain defeat if they have any other option. Elden Ring manages to get around this barrier by properly incentivizing engagement via tethering it to cooperation, but it doesn't change how people feel about PvP. In a way, it takes away choices as much as it adds them. If you want to be invaded but you don't want to cooperate, your only option is to lick the Taunter's tongue and invite constant invasions. And if you want to cooperate and don't want to PvP, you're discouraged from playing how you want for fear of reprisal. At least in previous games, you could take solace in knowing if you were eligible for invasions regardless, you may as well cooperate. Because invasions were a default state with a lower barrier to entry, every other choice was your own. But instead, From Software backed off. They decided invasions were more disruptive than they were worth and pushed them to the back. And not just invasions. All multiplayer has a permanent backseat in Elden Ring, and that might be the way it stays from here on out. I spent the years between Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring thinking of all the ways they could add to the multiplayer. Every game had improved and innovated in its own way, so I had big expectations, especially after Sekiro released and had no multiplayer functionality at all. I assumed they were hard at work and were going to make Elden Ring a multiplayer juggernaut. Clearly, I was wrong. From Software has pulled their focus away from multiplayer. They've turned invasions into an isolated gimmick completely misunderstood by new players. They've lost faith in their purpose. And by making invasions opt-in, it has a lasting impact on activity. Every hoop to jump through to get to a game mode makes it that much more exclusive. For something like multiplayer, barriers to entry can be a death sentence. In this way, as in so many, Elden Ring has managed the worst of both worlds. By making PvP optional, it removed its impact and its longevity. It's little more than an option. But that can and should change. PvP shouldn't be something players decide they're in the mood for. It should be a core consideration of the intended gameplay. That when you walk through these worlds, you will be met by challenges, both preset and random. Your experience should be just that. Your experience. No two runs the same. No two sessions alike. Invasions only add to that uniqueness. And I know invasions are disruptive. I know players can absolutely ruin the immersion by being someone on the internet. I'm someone on the internet and I ruin everything. But honestly, invasions are worth it. If given proper attention, they have the potential to redefine what the definitive RPG experience looks like. What's more immersive than the world having people who want to stop you work to stop you? What's more real than knowing you aren't the main character? Knowing that you share this world with both friends and foes? And let's not forget, the very concept of an invasion insists that it be uncontrolled, unable to be prevented. An invader attacks you when they decide. If you can just turn them away at the door, it's not really an invasion. So if you believe in invasions, and you have any faith or respect for the mechanic, you should want them made more than they have ever been, to be a primary feature of these games and cemented as core to the experience, rather than relegated to an optional annoyance. That's it for this video. I want to talk more about optional mechanics, especially difficulty settings and the like, in future videos, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, please consider liking and subscribing. Shadow of the Erdtree is just weeks away, and while it's not going to deliver on the PvP future I want, it'll be the best chance we'll have to invade for the foreseeable future. I'm prepping my builds and practicing my edgewalk. Until then, thank you for watching.